Well, welcome to Sister Reach's monthly social justice series. I am Elder Victor Hanna, Faith and Education Outreach Coordinator at Sister Reach. Sister Reach is a grassroots 501c3 reproductive justice organization founded by Cherie Scott in 2011 in Memphis, Tennessee. Sister Reach supports the reproductive autonomy of women and teens of color, poor and rural women, LGBTQIA plus people, and their families through the framework of reproductive justice. Sister Reach's mission is to empower our base to lead healthy lives, raise healthy families, and live in healthy and sustainable communities. This is achieved through working by a four-pronged strategy: education, policy, and advocacy, cultural shift, and harm reduction, locally, nationally, and internationally. Today, our guest is the Reverend Dr. Andre E. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the founding pastor of Gifts of Life Ministries, an inner city church built upon the servant leadership philosophy. He is married to Lisa Jones Johnson, owner of For Peaceful Resolutions, a conflict mediation company, as a called centered mission group oriented servant leadership church. He leads a congregation that focuses on the word of God in the feeding of the hungry, healing and deliverance of the sick and oppressed, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, visiting the prison bound, educating the unlearned, and loving the unloved. Dr. Johnson also leads a socially conscious and socially relevant ministry. Please help me welcome our Social Justice Preacher Series guests for the month of August, Reverend Dr. Andre E. Johnson. Welcome, sir.
Wow, thank you, thank you. And as usual, it is always an honor and a privilege to participate in anything that Sister Reach is doing. My good friend, giving her all of her praise and honors right now, Cherie Scott, and to Reverend Lee Salisbury, and to Elder Victor, and all that are part of putting this together. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for of seeing that I was worthy enough to come and to share on today. And so I thought about sharing something maybe a little bit different, doing a little teach preach here, but I do want to invite all who are listening. I wanted to do something special for Sister Reach. So shout out to all the Gifts of Life Ministries folk who are watching, G Life, the Urban Oasis, and all of you. Please click that share button, let people know that we are live right here. And we are, once again, doing the monthly social justice series with Sister Reach. Now, what I want to do is, I want to do something special for Sister Reach. And some of you know that back in 2018, my co-author and I, Dr. Amanda Neal Egger, wrote The Struggle Over All Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Important foundational book that talks about the Black Lives Matter movement. At the time, we talked about the counter movement, All Lives Matter. Book went on to win a National Book Award, was reviewed in major journals and used, and we went, different places and to talk about the book and talk about, what we were trying to say in the book, and it was well received. However, we thought that a follow-up was needed after the murder of George Floyd. So next spring, March, right around March, I'm told from the publisher, which is Mississippi Press. Shout out to Mississippi Press. March of 2024, we will publish a follow-up of the first book. And it is titled The Summer of 2020. So somebody ought to write that down. Put that in the comment section. Oh, let me put my preacher hat on. Put that in the comment section. The Summer of 2020, George Floyd, and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And so that's coming out, and you want to go ahead on, and when it hits a little bit later on in September, October for pre-order, you want to go ahead on and pre-order that. And what I want to try to do today is to encapsulate all of the different subjects that we could have talked about in this social justice series. And I really want to try to bring them together in this preach, teach, or in this presentation. Or in other words, I want to give you a little taste of what the book is all about. Can I do that? Is that all right? Somebody said, that's all right, preacher, go right ahead. You know, every now and then I'm gonna slide into my little preacher voice, and then I get back into my academic voice. But now I'm just gonna move in the preacher academic voice for a little bit. So what I want to talk about is rethinking faith and religion, the spirituality of Black Lives Matter. Rethinking faith and religion, the spirituality of Black Lives Matter. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to see how many people are watching, because I want to watch too. And I'm just going to do this right now. Bam. All right. Yeah. So I can see y'all if you're making comments or not. On June the 1st, 2020, President Donald Trump briefly addressed the nation amid an ongoing unrest over George Floyd's murder. He said that all Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, and he did say George, justice will be served. However, after promising justice for Floyd and his family, Trump shifted to address the angry mobs that drown out the voices of those, quote, peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. He vowed that he would keep them safe and fight to protect them. That day, he declared that he was the president of law and order and an ally to all peaceful protesters to protect you. Now, Trump saying that he was the president of law and order has a different ring to it on today, doesn't it? I'm gonna leave that alone. He blamed the unrest on state and local governments that had failed to take the necessary action to safeguard their residents. To address this, Trump promised that if a city or state could not take the necessary actions to defend life and property of their residents, then he would deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. He also said that he would take swift and decisive action to protect Washington, D.C., lamenting that he believed that the actions of some of the protesters the previous night were a total disgrace. Trump claimed to have dispatched thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement to stop the rioting, the looting, vandalism, assaults, and wanton destruction of property. However, while the president addressed the nation, the National Guard and law enforcement officials fired flashbang shells, gas, and rubber bullets, you remember, into a crowd of peaceful protesters gathered in Lafayette Square. The crowd would soon understand why they were forcibly removed to clear a path for Trump and government officials to walk over the St. John's Episcopal Church for what simply became a photo op. Now, if Trump's photo op was intended to show that he was a person of faith and that grounds his leadership decisions in his faith and perhaps get a boost in the polls, it failed miserably because other clergy spoke out against the president and his misuse of religious symbols. However, though, the next day didn't stop Trump because he doubled down on his religious photo ops by visiting John Paul's II National Shrine. Now, according to reports, the president and Melania Trump, quote, posed for photos in front of the statue of Pope John Paul II outside of the shrine and stood silently for a few minutes, hands clasped in front of them. The Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Gregory, criticized the president's visit. Gregory told reporters that he found it, quote, baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated in a fashion that violates our religious principles. Ones, he continued, which called on us to defend the rights of all people, even those with whom we might disagree. When taken together with his anti-protester law and order speech, Trump communicated a particular understanding of faith grounded in what Christian Kobitz Demuse called militant masculinity. In her book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, she argues that militant masculinity is an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. In short, when protests raged throughout the country to highlight what many believe was an injustice, George Floyd's murder, Trump responded by tapping into his evangelical base, by appealing to their religious values. Those values were not those that privilege humility and elevate the least of these, but one that derives gentleness as a province of wusses. Rather than turning the other cheek, she wrote, they resolved to defend their faith and their nation, secured in the knowledge that the ends justified the means. As the president communicated and performed a version of religiosity and faith, however, so did many of the protesters that gathered that day in Lafayette Square. Many were out there supporting Black Lives Matter because they understood faith differently. They understood faith differently and how it should operate. And as we did in that previous book that I told you about, in this new book that's coming out next spring, write it down, we focus again on interviewing activists and people who participated in the movement, and we are using their religious narratives to describe their own understandings of religion, faith, and spirituality that led them to become involved with BLM. Just as before, while many participants understood spirituality central to their connection to BLM, this heightened after George Floyd's murder. What we discovered was that for many participants, the movement had not only inspired and energized people of faith and Christian traditions, but it also inspired many people in different religious traditions to re-examine their own faith journeys. In short, for some, their faith and religious grounding helped them to cope with George Floyd's murder and compelled them to get active. However, some discovered that after Floyd's death, that their faith traditions could not even address the feelings that they were experiencing. And they had to draw on something else to get them out to participate. Now, at this part, I just want to go over just briefly, just share a little bit of what some of the respondents shared with us about their faith while they participated in Black Lives Matter protests or Black Lives Matter in general. While people of faith have been part of the Black Lives Matter movement since its inception, some told us, though, religion played no role in their involvement whatsoever. Some, like Peter, and these are not the real names of the folks, so I'm not outing anybody. Some, like Peter, who had no religious affiliation or connection at all. When we asked about the faith participation with BLM, he told us, yeah, you know, I'm not religious. Yeah, I never really grew up as a Christian or anything. I'm just totally interested in different cultures. My boyfriend is interested in Judaism. I think that's totally interesting. I love reading about the different intersections, what it means to be Black and Jewish or Black and Muslim. But personally, I really don't have that connection. It is this type of approach that Desiree speaks about as well. When we asked Desiree about the role of faith in BLM, she told us that some would prefer that religion not play a role at all. While in her community, people of faith were out at rallies, she told us that there is a big pushback from folks who suggest that this is not a faith-based movement at all. She told us that people in her community support BLM and believe it should not be a religious-based movement. Scott told us that in his community, there's a fight over BLM and over what social justice is all about. Listen to what he said. In terms of the way that we locally focus it here, I'm just going to say Southern Baptist, but when I talk about that, I really mean white evangelicalism, or at worst, straight up anti-Black white Christianity, meaning we don't want any part of that, of those things. But then the actual pro-BLM folk, who are my students, very much ground their religious identity within BLM. It's part of who I am as a religious person. While it's mostly Christian, I also seen it in Muslim, and I also seen them in other religious expressions. While those that would not subscribe to any of those faith traditions, or while like Desiree or like Peters, this is all wrapped up in BLM's understanding of what Anthony Penn calls an egalitarian approach. Penn argues that BLM offers a greater appreciation for the separation of church and state that affords a more robust and expansive narrative of justice, not strangled by restrictive theological categories or limitations. And I can talk about that more in the Q&A. Moreover, he continues that the egalitarian approach of Black Lives Matter opens and urges a greater sense of accountability and responsibility. Why? Because there are no special skills, no divine calling serving as a litmus test for an authentic voice. There is something more organic and synergistic about this decentralization of leadership. It is this egalitarian approach that makes room for people of faith, though. And this is what we found so fascinating. As we found in our previous study of BLM participants, many come to the movement with their faith intact and join in with this egalitarian notion of faith. For instance, Jennifer's role in BLM found resonance in her reading of the gospel narratives and how gospels speak out to injustice. She maintains that it's in her understanding of the gospels that she sees how Jesus felt about those who are on the margins. For those interactions demonstrated how Jesus reached all across the different lines to show radical love. For Akira, Black Lives Matter intersects with her faith because of her upbringing in church. She told us the way that a family and pastor and church members taught her Christianity, it was to love everybody. And she has a responsibility to love everybody and treat everybody equally. The whole ethic of love for people of the Christian faith grounds itself on another gospel teaching, loving neighbor as yourself. BLM activists, however, emphasize, listen, loving oneself as an essential and radical act. From the beginning of the movement, Alicia Garza called on Black people to, quote, love ourselves. That love helped launch the BLM movement. And since then, affirmation of Black life, Blackness, and self-love have always been a part of the movement. And somebody named Johnson argues the most radical love is self-love. In fact, In order to love others, one must be able to fully love oneself, because it is the foundation on which all of the love is based and grounded. It is the same type of love that Black Power advocates talked about back in the late 60s and 70s. It's the same kind of love that James Cone, the theologian who wrote about in Black theology, implied in loving God and neighbor is a self-love that anchors it all. In short, you cannot love anyone else until you love yourself. Bright Eyes sees her relationship with Jesus foundational in her role to Black Lives Matter. Speaking about the love, she keeps going back to Christ, and she keeps going back to the church. Quote, the church has to teach, she argues, that if there is to be salvation for you, then that salvation is tied to how you embrace the stranger, how you embrace somebody that you think is other. The church cannot be silent. The church has to play a role in where we are going in the future. We can't preach on Sunday, she continues, and sit in our homes and do nothing on Monday through Saturday. It can't be like that anymore, because the Black church has always been instrumental in the growth of Black society from the civil rights movement on. But somehow, I believe, she continues, she says, I believe they have lost their way. Now, Bright Eyes notes the importance and relevance of the Black church. For her, the Black church acknowledges the pain and the suffering of others and the joys and the celebrations. The church should also help those who are downtrodden, those underprivileged, to increase in stature. She ties this to salvation itself and how we embrace the stranger and the other. And that for me to be saved, she argues, I must help others to be saved. For Bright Eyes, by doing this, the church plays a role in where the people would head in the future. However, when she nears the end of her comment, she reveals that the church she spoke of was in the past during the civil rights movement, because today she argues that the church has lost its way. And this is a critique of the Black church. We have all heard it, especially in his relationship to BLM. It's nothing new. Early in the movement, even some Black pastors lamented the fact that there is a strange silence from Black churches regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. However, Bright Eyes' participation in the Black church and BLM also highlighted something else for us. As we discovered in our previous work, where participants did not believe that the Black church was a full participant in the BLM movement, or not to the level that would have satisfied them, many agreed that the faith they learned in the church was one of the primary reasons for their involvement with BLM. Can I say that again? That for their involvement with BLM, many recognized and realized that it all started in the church that they are right now critiquing. It was in the church that had lost its way that some of the participants still found a way to join the movement and grounded it in their faith experience. It speaks to the legacy and history of the Black church. It also speaks to the preaching and teaching of the Black church and the legacy of activism birthed from the church that bore witness to the issues germane to African Americans across a variety of places and spaces and all times. In short, even though Bright Eyes argued that the church had lost its way, there was enough of the church's tradition to help us see that a faith was indispensable in carrying out the work of Black liberation. Now, while much of the study of religion and social movements centered on how members of the movement perform their faith within the movement and how it already speaks to members' faith commitment, social movements can also challenge and expand members' faith. And one of the things that I talk about, even going out and being part of the community, if you really want to grow in your faith, go join a movement. Come and join the folk at Sister Reach. You're growing your faith. Because for some, BLM prompted a crisis of moral conscience. And according to Professor Drew Hart, forced people to do some social change work. One such person was Pastor Brenda Salter McNeil. McNeil, who describes herself as a Black evangelical, told the New Yorker magazine that before BLM, she would, quote, explicitly avoid talking about aspects of structural racism, such as the racial wealth gap or the high death rate of Black mothers during childbirth. She would preach sermons that she felt were rooted in the Bible and not in what she thought was just politics. When she gave workshops, she would focus on inspiring personal stories, but left listeners with few practical tools to root out racism in their communities. However, that all began to change for her and other evangelical ministers when they arrived in Ferguson in 2014, and they started asking people what the church could do to help. And what they found were activists disillusioned with the church. After listening to them, she understood that she was on the wrong side of justice and began to re-examine her own theology. She earnestly believed that if she could have convinced evangelical Christians that reconciliation was not some politically motivated agenda, but a biblical calling rooted in scripture, they would pursue racial justice. Now she believed that that was naive thinking. She now thinks that religious leaders and people of faith must actively campaign against systemic racism if they are going to affect change. It reminds me of the question I was asked yesterday during a panel. How can we frame and construct language that makes people want to join our movements instead of pushing people away? And he used King as an analogy, and I just had to push it back just a little, because some folk you're not going to persuade no matter what. There is something called an unpersuadable audience for you. And what you need to do is what Salter McNeil finally realized: actively campaign against systemic racism if you are going to affect change. And that means speaking things as they are. Speaking things as they are. No euphemism, no sugarcoating, no dancing around. Speaking and naming the demon, if you will. Now, some participants also told us that BLM was challenging to their faith as well. Others, like Hannah, wrestled with some of the contradictions she found in her support of BLM. As a person of faith and a chaplain, Hannah told us that she struggled with making those theological connections. And what does that say about who you are as a people? Others had that same frustration, that if you grow up one way, and some of you know what I'm talking about, you grow up traditionally in your church, mosque, or synagogue one way, and then something is happening in the world that you know is right and just, and you need to be a part of it, but your faith cannot speak to it because you weren't raised that way. People had those kind of struggles, and it was good struggles. But for some, it led them to have to leave the church. Macy, for instance, listen to this quote: "I'm not a church-going human now, but me and Jesus, we good." And that's how I kind of explain my religion and my spirituality. I left the church because of racism and sexism, and everything that churches do kind of really bothered me, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And then some had to leave their faith due to embracing Black Lives Matter altogether. Not just the church, but their whole faith tradition. A person who called himself Dave said it this way: "I had to put my faith I was raised in behind me because I was not going to move where I needed to move. So yeah, I'm post-faith tradition at this point." But the last piece I want to talk about is talking about faith and Blackness, and how being a part of this movement helped folk really begin to understand that Blackness is a gift from God. In short, for some respondents, their understanding of Blackness itself and their own Blackness helped shape their understanding of faith. And speaking of her Blackness and being created in the image of God, Cheryl told us, quote, "This is the isness of my Blackness, or the Blackness of my people, or Afro diaspora persons being created in the image of God, and therefore their humanity, their dignity, and all that which God has created them has value and meaning, and it has purpose, and it's part of God's plan. She continues, and that thing must be lifted up because it continues time after time after time after time after time and time again, constantly being destroyed and decimated, disappeared, erased, not just in the physical forms, but in history and in everything else. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, or at least when I talk about it, for me, I'm talking about the very essence of a people and everything that we bring to the table. You see, for Cheryl, her value and meaning are wrapped up in her understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God. In the image of God as a Black woman. Blackness for her is not a bad or evil thing. It is how she was made in the image of God. It is a part of God's plan, and it needs to be lifted and celebrated. Regina echoes much of what Cheryl says by expanding on it even more. Her faith, as well as her Blackness, plays an essential role in her support of Black Lives Matter, pointing to the shirt she wore on the day that she talked with us. The shirt read, "Humanize being Black." She told us, you see being Black, it is definitely part of my faith, and it's part of the reason it's a part of my faith is not just because of the church that I attend, but because in life, when we talk about that connection that God created us, we have to know that God didn't make a mistake when God made us Black. God did not make a mistake when God made you. And that's something that we have to share. And that's part of the theology that's come out, and it's free. And it's that liberation theology that said that God did not make a mistake when God made some of us to have a little bit more melanin than others have. And that's okay. Now, we did not find any of these responses surprising, really, because in our previous work, several respondents identified the same thing. BLM's focus on affirming all Black lives and people resistance and resilience in facing oppression gave our respondents a greater appreciation on their own Blackness. Many Black people of faith see this Blackness as a gift from God. Now, Autumn didn't talk about her Blackness directly, but she talked about the importance of discernment. And Autumn told us that because she was a Christian, she has no choice but to bring her faith up in activity with BLM. She further told us that her relationship with her faith and God help her discern when to post something, when not to post something, and what would be more impactful. Autumn's faith is more than simply spiritual, though. She believes that the people of faith can directly affect a movement's success and progress. Now, in his book, a good friend of Sister Reach, the Reverend Earl Fisher, in his book, The Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., and the Black Prophetic Tradition, a reintroduction of the Black Messiah, Fisher argues that Reverend Clegg similarly argued the same point during the Black Power movement. Grounded in an understanding that Christians should worship the Black Messiah, Fisher maintains that Clegg saw the people leading and participating in the Black Power movement as already doing the work of God. Fisher argues that the Black Christianity that Clegg promoted was independent of the institutional church, arguing that the Black Messiah, Jesus, did not build a church, but a movement. Fisher writes that Clegg situated the Black church as a location for movement and nation building. So I come asking, how would it shape our theology if we see Jesus building not a church, but a movement? Clegg further maintained that the Black Power movement was the Christian church of the 20th century, and that the Christian church cannot be the church until it becomes what? A movement. Clegg even went so far as to suggest that the church ordained people that were in the movement. Quote, you could be ordained in this church as a civil rights worker if we could somehow do away with the distinctions which exist in people's mind between what's religious and not religious. To ordain civil rights workers for civil rights work would declare that the Christian church believes that this is the Christianity in which we talk about, that individuals who gave their lives in the struggle for human freedom, and I'm feeling my help coming, are Christian, and that the movement is not only Christian, but it's the movement of and is the church. Thus, Fisher argues that Clegg's rhetorical aim was to speak into the existence, that liberation of Black people, that transformation of the Black church, and the reconciliation of Black people to the Black church. The ordination of young Black radicals was a strategy to achieve those goals. For many activists and adherents of BLM, this is done by first situating Blackness as a gift from God. Listen, as I wrap up this little word today, we discovered that many people appreciated BLM's egalitarian approach to faith. While there are people of faith in the movement also welcomes people with no relationship to religion or who practice a blend of religious traditions. This egalitarian approach provides avenues for people to explore their own Blackness and how that Blackness is shaped and performed. It creates an opening for people to re-examine and explore different versions, notions, and attitudes about faith. It allows for growth and diversity of religious expression, giving people an opportunity to offer critique and even be challenged by previous religious presuppositions. Moreover, it gives license to provide a way out of toxic religious and spiritual relationships that are not life-affirming. Get out of those toxic relationships. Come out of Babylon. Because this egalitarian approach becomes all the more important after George Floyd's murder, as BLM was quickly becoming the largest social movement in the history of the United States. It proved advantageous not only to see the movement as a religious one, but as one open to an eclectic diversity of religious experiences and expressions. A movement that does not highlight or focus on one particular brand of faith, but one that allows any or no expression of faith to move people in unison to declare that Black lives matter. Thank you.
Reverend Dr. Andre Johnson, thank you so very much. You have given us so much meat to eat off of, and thank you for taking the time out to be with us, even as you're celebrating your anniversary. So we say happy anniversary to you. And man, you've given us so much. Let me go ahead and put a plug for your new book, The Summer of 2020, George Floyd and the Resurgence of Black Lives Matter. Rethinking faith and religion, right? And I think a lot of the historical background that you gave during the time, a lot of this happened during the time where the onset of COVID.
Yes.
You know, we've had to readjust and we've had to rethink a lot of things, right? And especially in the faith world, how we conducted our religious services, how we presented the gospel was different. So absolutely rethinking faith and religion as it relates to these areas of topic that you discussed today is extremely important. But I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the comment that you stated regarding Penn's statement for the egalitarian approach.
Yeah.
And you said that her idea or his idea was centered more around open and more accountability, making room for people of faith. And so it's my understanding, and maybe you can expound. So the egalitarian is a philosophy perspective that emphasizes equality and equal treatment across gender, religion, economic status, and political beliefs. Can you kind of expound on how that relates to faith and religion in regards to rethinking?
No, great question. Remember now, we did a set of interviews with people who were active, and I'm glad you brought up COVID and the pandemic, because our interviews were just like this. We were on Zoom because of COVID and people. So we got a nice eclectic group of people from around the country who actually participated in protests and marches and vigils and doing the things that we saw on TV all over. And when we asked about faith, they're the ones that's bringing this up, like, either I was rooted in my faith tradition and I was good, and I thought somebody like myself who I'm out there because of my faith, and then others, hey, I ain't got no faith, and I'm gonna hang out with the people with faith, because BLM and the movement was much bigger at that moment, at least, and this is what they were argued, than any of the religious distinctions. But Anthony Penn, who is a religious studies scholar himself, helps us understand that by calling it this egalitarian approach, giving us a framework. I imagine it's actually something that you do, Elder, that when you talk to people that may have different interpretations or different opinions, you try to bring all of the voices together because there is an issue that is germane or important for all people involved. And BLM naturally does that. So you do not have to be a Christian. You do not have to be Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or no faith. You can be seeking, you can be searching. And that opens up the possibility of even understanding sexuality, sexual orientation, gender, and all of that, because all of that is rooted into toxic, what I call toxic religion anyway. And so if I'm in BLM and I'm seeing all of these different folk, all of these different colors, all of these different genders, all of these different orientations, and I'm still holding on to my own faith tradition, and I don't see myself being bothered or hindered in any way, that's that egalitarian approach. And BLM did that for a lot of folk. For a lot of, I couldn't include everyone, of course, in the presentation today, but some people told us it was because of the BLM they returned to the church. Or that they're not in church, but they now better understand the people of faith who came out there. And who would have brought those different people and perspectives together other than BLM, especially during the time when everybody in the country saw that an injustice happened right before our eyes.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, rethinking our faith hopefully is causing us to be more open. It's one thing, I think we've had a conversation a few weeks back. It's one thing to hold on to your traditions, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But we now have COVID has caused a shift, right? And we must be more open in our understanding, in our conversation, in our dialogue, because the bottom line is that egalitarianism is about belief in human equality. And in our faith organizations, we are serving what? Humans.
Right.
So it seems like it's only natural, and I like your perspective, it seems only natural that we would open up that dialogue and conversation and leave, our traditions for the moment to have those discussions, because these people, the people, or the human rights, or humanity is what we do, is who we serve.
That's right. That's right. And I would just jump out on a branch a little bit further and say to all of the people that's watching this, and if you subscribe to a liberationist ethic in your religious understanding and in your religious performance, you eventually have to grow. There's no other choice. And so, because revelation is happening all the time, you are
Absolutely.
discerning all the time. And
Absolutely.
so, and yeah, sometimes it gets nerve-wracking. It gets like, oh God, again, you're bothering me again about this, whatever. Oh, I thought I had this down, and something happened, and I know that I need to go back to my prayer closet because I can't handle it. So if you are subscribing to that anyway, you are going to, the growth is going to be there, and the understanding is going to be there. And here's the thing. And I'm not talking about understanding for understanding's sake. I'm just talking about understanding for the appreciation's sake. That's like, you are still, through it all, you're human.
Absolutely.
And we are talking about human bodies. This is why, and again, not to blow any smoke, but this is just true. This is why the work of Sister Reach is so important. They are working, and I'm so glad that you're using a faith component to this as well, but also open, being egalitarian again, to folk of no faith, to talk about these bodies that are being decimated, man, that are being pushed to the margins, that are being stepped on, that are being lied to, that are being told that they are worthless. And it's Sister Reach and other organizations like that are talking about that. And we as a community need to get behind that effort, because I'm telling you, it is important and it is God's work. And I am so glad that you're doing it. And I'm glad I'm a small part of it as well.
Absolutely. And you said it's a part of God's work. I think it's key. You also talked about radical love and radical self-love being important. And Leviticus 19:33 and 31, 33 and 34, it says, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. So we see these type of scriptures, right, in the faith community. And so kind of talk a little bit more about embracing the stranger and what that means.
Well, I mean, we're seeing it in real time. We're seeing that scripture being nullified in real time down in Texas. Governor Abbott is putting buoys and objects that can cut asylum seekers, people who are looking for hope and help, and hopefully looking for people that know the God that of that text that says, hey, treat the hell here. But see, here's the part that I think we kind of forget. And the reason why it is hard to do that. Man, if you don't, authentically love yourself, and I'm not talking of just self-aggrandizement or some sort of self-loving that is toxic, that, I'm all that and nobody. No, I'm not. I'm talking about a healthy self-love. If I can't healthily self-love me and all of my quirks and my good points, my bad points and stuff, and then even critique myself and say, I need to get better in something. That's a healthy self-love. If I can't do that, I am incapable. That's what I'm trying to get people under. I am authentically, I can mask it. I can play like it for a while. I can make it seem like I love, but if I don't love me, I can't love you. And if I don't love myself, what you think I'm going to do to you? And that's the problem that we have in this. This is the problem with all of these laws that are being passed against trans people, against Black folk, right now in the state of Tennessee, we're trying to, in our loving, compassionate way, trying to say guns is an issue. It is killing our are trying to say that. We're trying to articulate that. We're bearing witness to that. We don't have anything but a voice, a body, and a sign. And just the other day, they took away the signs. So, so if I am pouring out that love, and the person that's on the receiving end and all of that really does not understand that and can't get his or her head or their head wrapped around that, come on, it's almost impossible. And so this is why the commandment, love God, is all that you're gonna love yourself. But we know there are a lot of people that don't. And if you can't love yourself, you can't love others.
Absolutely. This is my last question, and then we have a question that is in the chat that we're going to address. And my question is in regards to your statement regarding Salter McNeil and her basically rethinking of the Christian involvement or the faith leader involvement in social justice. And so my question to you as a person, you there?
No, yeah, you were freezing up.
Sorry
about Salter McNeil, and then
and her rethinking of her position regarding the churches or the faith communities involvement in social activism. And you made a statement that, regarding the activists disillusioned with the church. Right. And also we see that there are some challenges that the church also has with some activism or being a part of it. A lot of it is that they don't even realize that that's their role and that what God has called them to do, what God called us to do. But can you speak to leaders who are basically religious leaders or faith leaders who are basically on the fence,
right,
and kind of help us understand our importance, right, in supporting these type of causes?
Listen, I have been for the last, at least, I don't know, 20 years. I've been I finished in 2008, so I've been teaching for like 20 years. So I have been publicly saying that we all of us, we can all do better, because, okay, let me put it this way. We all need to re-examine our. However, much of this that we have with ministers and pastors and church leaders and lay leaders not being as active is because they really believe that, for a lot of them, that's not the role of the church. And if that's my theology, it's going to be hard to shake. So I have dedicated my life to trying to educate, re-educate ministers and other lay leaders and stuff. My work at Memphis Theological Seminary, my work in the community, my work at Gifts of Life Ministries, my work doing this, and all the other forums I get an opportunity to speak, that it is, you are not going to hell body out on a street corner holding up a sign that says that, God loves all. I mean, that is the crux. Our faith tradition, Christianity, but other religious traditions. That is the foundation of those traditions. So for me, it is just an easy task. And one must then begin to re-engage with their own theological frameworks, be open to the Spirit, because a lot of things that you're not going to find immediately in the scriptures that you're looking for, simply because you are not even aware that it could be there.
Or even searching.
Just like somebody saying that a woman should not preach, and women can't, God don't call no women to preach. And you hear women preach and you say, oh my God, she preached the paint off the wall. Then now you got a conundrum. What you think that you know versus what you just saw. and you know what you just saw was authentic, and it moved you to tears. You shouted, and you knew that was right. So if God didn't do that, then who did it? And now you are trying to go back and re-examine what it is that I thought I knew. And then that's how you grow. Be open to the Spirit. It's okay. It is okay to be open to the Spirit. And if this was a full class, I would demonstrate ways that the Apostle Paul does that and gives us, since everybody like to go to Paul, he gives us a leadway to do the same. So I just advise all folks to keep studying, keep reading, keep discerning, keep praying, keep asking the Spirit to show you, and don't be afraid to take the leap of faith.
Thank you so much. I think that last phrase is what is a very encouraging. Don't be afraid to take that leap of faith. Proverbs 21:15 says, when justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to the evildoers. And that's the kind of work that I believe that we're supporting, and that's the kind of work that we're doing. You also talked about the ordination of civil rights workers, right? And so one of the questions here is there a particular site or place that activists can go to be ordained as a minister of justice?
Not that I know of, but I have been in talks with a couple of folk, and we really are thinking about how maybe that could be done. When I first read that in Pastor Earl's book on Albert Clegg, and when Clegg in one of his sermons talked about that, it really lit a fire under me, because I fundamentally believe that. I believe that the activists that are doing the work, the folk that we see out in the streets, the folk that are protesting, are doing the work of God. And what would it look like if they were ordained as such? That's your ministry. That's your call. The community. Many churches will hire of social justice and community. And you got hundreds of folk already out on the street doing that type of work. What would it look like? I mean, I'm interested in that discussion. And right now, I am actively thinking about it. I'm actively doing it. I don't know of anybody that's doing it now or any place, but it is something that that intrigues me. And I think I can justify it theologically. I think it's wholesome and good, and it would not look like the typical ordinations, of course, and it would not look like what we are typically used to on Sunday mornings. But that's okay, because guess what? The church that was in 1900 does not look like the church of the day either. But it's still the church, and we still made it through. So stuff does happen, stuff does change from time to time. But I'm interested in having those conversations.
Absolutely. I mean, as we are rethinking faith and religion, that's one part of it, right? But as you're talking about it, I was just here thinking about some pastors that I've been encountered with over the years, and that have talked about advocacy work and justice or whatever, and they always point, of course, to Dr. Martin Luther King, and they'll say, well, he was called to do that. I'm not called to do that, right? And so just to kind of support what you were saying, a calling, if he was called to do that type of work, and we see some of the change and that was experienced by that particular type of work, it just seems kind of again something that we can definitely talk about and put some legs to. So
right, yes. And everybody needs, and you know what, you may not be, and I tell people this, you may not be particularly called to do the particular work that Dr. King particularly did in his season of his call. Granted, however, you are called to be part of the movement. And if Clegg is right, which I will also agree with Albert Clegg on this one, that Jesus is not necessarily building church, but a movement. And the church becomes the people of God, which is already in our theology to begin with. And if that church represents Jesus's body, we ought to be doing what Jesus did in the body while he was in a body on earth. And if we do believe in the incarnation, we have to believe in the intentionality of that incarnation, in which God divested God's self into Jesus and hung out with who? The least of these, the poor, the downtrodden, and all of those in a movement. So what if we began to have a theological outlook that God is movement and God is part of movement for justice, equality, and love? If we begin to start doing that and living that out, I think a whole lot of stuff could change.
Absolutely. Well, Reverend Dr. Andre E. Johnson, we have so enjoyed your presentation. We've enjoyed this discussion, and thank you so much for spending some time with us. And we hope that you will share with us again. Any last parting words as we sign off?
Just a shout out again to all the good work that Sister Reach is doing in these perilous times that we're living in, with more restrictions on reproductive choice, or more restrictions on women's bodies. The work that you're doing is of God, and may God continue to bless you. May God continue to strengthen and uplift you. And may you be continued to be lifted by God's love and grabbed by God's grace.
Sir, thank you so much for those blessings, and you have a great and wonderful anniversary.
All right.
Have a good one. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.